They sold her like cattle under the desert sun. 36 men throwing coins while she stood trembling on a wooden platform, knowing whoever won would own her body, her future, her name. Clara Whitmore had watched 3 women dragged away screaming that morning. Now it was her turn. But when the most dangerous man in the territory rode into Dead Horse Crossing and tore apart their sick game, she discovered something worse than being sold. Freedom might actually kill her. This is the story of a woman who burned down every chain they wrapped around her throat. Hit that like button and drop your city in the comments so I can see how far Clara's story travels. Let's begin. The rope burns on Clara's wrists had stopped bleeding 2 days ago, but the shame hadn't stopped at all. She sat in the back of the wagon with 7 other women, their faces blank as corpses, while the wheels churned through sand and their futures dissolved into something they couldn't name. Nobody spoke. Speaking made it real. The desert stretched endlessly in all directions, red rock, scrub brush, heat that turned the air into liquid shimmer. Clara's dress stuck to her skin. Her throat felt like sandpaper. She hadn't cried since they took her from the church steps 3 weeks ago, and she sure as hell wasn't starting now. The woman next to her was maybe 19, maybe 40. The sun had cooked the age right out of her face. She'd been muttering prayers under her breath for miles, the same 3 lines over and over until the words lost meaning. Clara wanted to tell her to save her breath. Praying hadn't helped the others. It wouldn't help them. Dead Horse Crossing, 10 minutes. The driver's voice cut through the wagon like a rusty blade. The praying woman went silent. Clara looked down at her hands. They were small, soft, useless. The hands of someone who'd spent 22 years pouring tea and reading scripture and believing the world had rules. She'd been so goddamn stupid. The world didn't have rules. It had teeth, and it was currently chewing her into pieces. The wagon lurched over a rut, and someone whimpered. Clara didn't turn to see who. She kept her eyes on the horizon where Dead Horse Crossing was taking shape. A scatter of wooden buildings bleeding heat waves, a single street of packed dirt, and in the center of town, a platform. The auction platform. Even from a distance, she could see men gathering around it like flies on a carcass. Listen up. The driver twisted in his seat, his face leather and tobacco stains. Y'all are gonna walk up them steps real peaceful-like. No crying, no fighting, no running. Men paid good money for this lottery to be legal and proper. You resist, you'll be dragged. Understand? Legal. Clara almost laughed. There was nothing legal about what they'd done, rounding up widows, abandoned wives, daughters of dead men, anyone without protection or papers. The territorial government was 300 miles away and couldn't give a damn about women disappearing into the frontier. So Dead Horse Crossing had invented its own law, the bride lottery. A man paid his silver, drew a name, and walked away with a woman. Simple, efficient, monstrous. The wagon stopped. Clara's heart kicked against her ribs like a trapped animal, but she forced her face into stone. She'd learned that from her father before the fever took him. Never let them see you break. He'd been the preacher in a town called Salvation Creek, back when she still believed salvation was possible. He'd taught her scripture and dignity, and the foolish notion that being good meant being safe. Then he died, and the vultures descended. First came the debt she didn't know existed, then the eviction from the church house. Then the night 3 men showed up claiming her father had signed a contract, a lie so obvious it should have been laughable, except the sheriff had looked the other way, and suddenly Clara was cargo. Property. A problem solved. The driver yanked the wagon gate open. Out! Now! The women climbed down one by one, their legs shaking from days of being cramped and terrified. Clara was 5th in line. When her boots hit the dirt, the heat slammed into her skull like a hammer. The sun was a white coin burning a hole through the sky. She could smell the crowd before she saw them clearly. Whiskey, sweat, desperation, and something worse. Entitlement. The stink of men who believed the world owed them something soft to break. Dead Horse Crossing wasn't a big town, maybe 200 people, but it looked like every male over 16 had shown up for the lottery. They lined both sides of the street, leaning against posts, sitting on barrels, passing bottles. Their eyes moved over the women like hands. Clara felt their stares crawling across her skin and wanted to scrape herself raw. Keep moving. The driver prodded her forward with a rifle butt. They were herded toward the platform where a fat man in a vest stood shuffling papers. Mayor Hutchins. Clara had heard his name whispered in the wagon, a failed businessman who'd invented the bride lottery to save the town's economy and his own reputation. Apparently, Dead Horse Crossing had been dying, losing population, until Hutchins realized desperate men would pay premium rates for guaranteed wives. Now the town was thriving. Women were the currency. "Gentlemen," Hutchins raised his hands like a carnival barker. "Welcome to the 14th Dead Horse Crossing Bride Lottery. As always, we operate under the full authority of territorial contract law. Get on with it," someone shouted. Laughter rippled through the crowd. Hutchins smiled, unbothered. Each participating gentleman has purchased an entry ticket. Names have been verified, fees collected, and contracts prepared. When your name is drawn, you'll come forward to claim your bride. All sales are final. All marriages are binding. Any questions? What if she's ugly? More laughter. Clara's jaw clenched so hard her teeth ached. Hutchins chuckled. Then I suggest you close your eyes and think of the future, son. Now, let's begin. The first woman was called almost immediately. Her name was Beth, and she'd been in the wagon clutching a rag doll like a child. When they announced that a man named Silas Root had won her, Beth started shaking so violently Clara could hear her bones rattling. Root was 70, if he was a day, with knuckles like tree burls and a reputation for working his ranch hands into the grave. He climbed the platform, grabbed Beth's arm, and dragged her down the steps while she vomited into the dirt. Nobody helped her. The second woman fought. She was older, maybe 35, with a scar across her cheek and eyes that said she'd already survived worse than this. When they called her name and some kid barely 20 claimed her, she spat in his face and tried to run. She made it maybe 10 feet before 2 deputies tackled her into the street. They held her down while the kid signed papers, then hauled her away screaming. The crowd cheered. Clara watched it all with a face like cut glass. The third woman fainted before her name was even drawn. They slapped her awake, read her name anyway, Mary Frost, and handed her over to a man who looked at her the way you'd look at a broken tool, annoyed but willing to make it work. Then Hutchins reached into the lottery barrel and pulled out another slip of paper. His smile widened. Miss Clara Whitmore. The world tilted sideways. C'est calme. Clara's legs almost buckled, but she locked her knees and forced herself to stay upright. 36 men had entered the lottery today. 36. The odds of any single one of them winning her should have been slim, but she could feel their eyes sharpening, their hunger focusing. They all wanted the preacher's daughter, the one who could read and write, the one who still looked clean. Hutchins gestured toward the platform. Come on up, Miss Whitmore. Let's see who fate has in store for you. Clara climbed the steps. Each one felt like walking to a gallows. When she reached the top and turned to face the crowd, the noise hit her like a wall, hooting, whistling, men shouting bids even though the lottery wasn't an auction. Except it was. They all knew it was. Hutchins made a show of shuffling the entry slips, building anticipation. Clara scanned the faces below. She recognized some of them, drifters, miners, ranch hands with reputations for violence. Others were strangers, which somehow felt worse. At least with a familiar monster, you knew what kind of nightmare you were entering. And the winner is a sound cut through the square. Hoofbeats. Hard and fast. The crowd turned as a single rider came thundering down the main street, scattering men like buckshot. The horse was a massive black beast, flecked with foam, and the man on its back was something out of a fever dream. Tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a long leather duster that moved like smoke. His face was shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat, but Clara caught a glimpse of sharp features, a jaw like an axe blade, and eyes that cut through the daylight like winter stars. The horse stopped 10 feet from the platform. Dust bloomed around them. Nobody spoke. The entire town had gone silent. The rider dismounted in one fluid motion, his boots hitting the dirt with a sound like a judge's gavel. He pulled an entry slip from his pocket and held it up. I'm in the lottery, he said. His voice was low, rough, the kind of sound that made your spine straighten involuntarily. Name's Kyle Varick. The crowd erupted. Men shouted, stumbled backward, reached for weapons they didn't draw. Clara knew that name. Everyone in the territory knew that name. Kyle Varick. Half rancher, half outlaw. A man who lived in the Canyon Badlands where even the army didn't go. There were stories about him. Some said he'd killed a dozen men. Others said it was more like 50. Some claimed he was a deserter from a war nobody could name. Others swore he'd built his ranch on land soaked with blood and didn't bother washing the stains off. What everyone agreed on, Kyle Varick was dangerous, and he just entered a bride lottery. Hutchins recovered first, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Mr. Varick, we weren't expecting, that is, we didn't realize you'd registered. Paid my fee 3 weeks ago, Kyle said flatly. My entry's valid. Of course, of course. Hutchins' hands fluttered over his papers like dying birds. It's just unusual for someone of your stature to participate in. Draw the name. It wasn't a request. Hutchins swallowed hard and reached into the barrel. His hand shook as he pulled out a slip, unfolded it, and read the name written there. His face went white. Kyle Varick. The crowd exploded. Men surged forward, shouting accusations of fraud, rigged lotteries, impossible odds. Someone threw a bottle that shattered against the platform. Another man pulled a knife. But Kyle didn't move. He just stood there, a pillar of absolute stillness in the chaos. And somehow, that was more terrifying than any weapon. Clara's brain had stopped processing information. This couldn't be real. Kyle Varick couldn't have just won her in a lottery. That wasn't how fate worked. It wasn't supposed to trade one nightmare for something potentially worse. Hutchins raised his voice over the mob. The draw is legitimate. All entries were properly registered and… Bullshit! A man pushed to the front of the crowd, his face purple with rage. Varick fixed this. He's got half the territory terrified of him, probably threatened you and… Kyle's hand moved to his hip where a revolver hung like a sleeping snake. He didn't draw it, didn't need to. The man's voice died mid-sentence. You calling me a cheat? Kyle asked quietly. The man opened his mouth, closed it, took 3 steps backward. Kyle turned to Hutchins. The papers. Hutchins practically threw the marriage contract at him. Kyle caught it one-handed, glanced at the words without really reading them, and then looked up at Clara for the first time. Their eyes met, and Clara felt something jolt through her chest. Not fear exactly, though there was plenty of that. Something sharper. Recognition, maybe? Like looking at a wolf and understanding that you were both trapped in the same burning forest. Kyle's expression didn't change. He folded the papers and shoved them inside his coat. Let's go, he said. Clara didn't move. Her brain was screaming at her to run, to fight, to do literally anything except get on a horse with a man whose reputation included the word bloodbath. But her legs wouldn't cooperate. They'd been obeying orders for so long, climb in the wagon, walk up the steps, stand still and be sold, that rebellion felt like a foreign language. Kyle waited maybe 5 seconds before he made a sound of impatience and climbed onto the platform himself. The wood groaned under his weight. Up close, he was even more imposing, easily 6'3", built like he'd been carved from the same red rock that surrounded the town. His face was all hard angles and old scars, the kind of face that had forgotten how to smile years ago. But his eyes weren't cruel, they were just empty. Like he'd looked at the world until there was nothing left worth seeing. He stopped in front of her. You coming voluntarily, or do I carry you? Clara found her voice. It came out steadier than she expected. If I say no, then you stay here and one of them gets you. Kyle jerked his chin toward the mob, where men were still shouting, still arguing, still looking at her like she was a piece of meat they'd been cheated out of. Your choice. It wasn't a choice. They both knew it. Clara looked at Hutchins, who was sweating through his vest. She looked at the crowd. She looked at the other women being dragged away to lives that would break them slowly, piece by piece. And then she looked back at Kyle Varick, the man who'd just become her legal owner according to laws that shouldn't exist but did. I'll walk, she said. Something flickered in Kyle's eyes. Approval maybe, or just acknowledgement. He turned and headed for the platform steps. Clara followed because staying was worse. Her hands were shaking so badly she had to clench them into fists. They descended into the crowd, which parted like water around Kyle, but pressed close enough that Clara could smell the whiskey on their breath. Someone grabbed her arm. She jerked away and nearly fell, but Kyle's hand shot out and caught her elbow, steadying her without breaking stride. His grip was iron firm but not painful. He released her the second she found her balance. They reached the black horse. Kyle mounted first, then extended a hand down to Clara. She stared at it for a heartbeat, calloused, scarred across the knuckles, the hand of someone who'd built and destroyed in equal measure. Then she took it because the alternative was being torn apart by a mob of drunken men who believed they'd been robbed. Kyle pulled her up behind him like she weighed nothing. "Hold on!" Clara barely had time to grab his coat before the horse launched forward. The world became a blur of speed and dust, the shouts of the crowd fading behind them as they galloped out of Dead Horse Crossing. Clara pressed her face against Kyle's back, her arms locked around his waist, her heart trying to explode through her ribs. They rode hard for what felt like hours, but was probably 20 minutes, the landscape shifting from scrub desert to red rock formations that jutted from the earth like broken teeth. The heat was suffocating. Clara's lungs burned with each breath. She kept waiting for Kyle to slow down, to stop, to say something, anything, but he just kept riding deeper into the wilderness. Finally, when the town was nothing but a memory and the canyon walls had swallowed the sky, Kyle pulled the horse to a walk. Clara's entire body ached from the ride. Her hands had gone numb from gripping so hard. "You can let go now," Kale said. Clara released him and nearly fell off the horse in the process. Kale caught her again. This was becoming a pattern, and helped her slide to the ground. Her legs buckled immediately. She sat down hard in the dirt, gasping. Kyle dismounted and pulled a canteen from his saddle. He tossed it to Clara. "Drink, small sips." She unscrewed the cap with shaking hands and took a mouthful of water. It was warm and tasted like metal, but it was the most beautiful thing she'd ever experienced. She forced herself to sip slowly, even though every cell in her body screamed for more. Cale walked a few paces away and scanned the horizon, his hand resting on his revolver. After a minute, he seemed satisfied they weren't being followed and turned back to Clara. He pulled the marriage contract from his coat, unfolded it, and without ceremony tore it into pieces. The scraps fluttered to the ground like snow. Clara stared at the shredded paper, her brain refusing to process what she was seeing. "What?" Her voice cracked. She tried again. "What are you doing?" "Nullifying a contract I never intended to honor," Kyle said flatly. "But you entered the lottery. You paid the fee. I entered because the whole system is rotted through," Kyle interrupted. "Figured if I won, I could pull at least one woman out of that meat grinder. Looks like it was you." He kicked at the torn papers. "You're not my wife. You're not my property. You're just someone who needed an exit, and I happened to have one available." Clara's hands were shaking again, but this time it wasn't fear. It was something closer to rage. "So what happens now? You brought me out here to just abandon me in the desert? How is that better?" "It's better because you get to choose what comes next." Cale's eyes were flat, unreadable. "I'm heading to my ranch. It's 2 days' ride deeper into the canyon. You can come with me, stay until you figure out your next move. Or I can leave you supplies, and you can try your luck finding a town that isn't run by scum like Hutchins. Your call." "That's not a choice," Clara said bitterly. "That's death in 2 different flavors." "Maybe, but it's still more choice than you had on that platform." Clara wanted to scream. She wanted to throw the canteen at his head. She wanted to wake up and discover the last month had been a nightmare. Instead, she just sat there in the dirt, staring at a man who'd torn up a contract that legally made her his possession, and tried to figure out if he was the most dangerous thing she'd ever encountered or the first honest one. "Why?" The word came out raw. "Why did you do this? What do you get out of it?" Cale was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was low enough that Clara had to strain to hear it. "I had a sister once. She got sold in a lottery similar to that one, different town, same rot. I was 15, couldn't stop it. She lasted 3 months before she hung herself in a barn." He looked at Clara directly, and for the first time she saw something in his eyes besides emptiness, old pain, deep and permanent. "I can't fix what happened to her, but I can sure as hell make sure it doesn't happen to someone else when I've got the means to stop it." Clara's throat closed. She couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. All she could do was stare at this man who'd ripped her away from one nightmare and offered her something she didn't have a name for yet. Cale turned back to his horse. "Sun's gonna set in a few hours. We should move. You riding with me, or you want to try your luck alone?" Clara looked around at the vast, empty canyon, red rock and brutal sun, and silence so deep it had weight. She'd never been alone in the wilderness. She'd never been alone anywhere. Her entire life had been walls and rules and people telling her where to stand and how to survive. She pushed herself to her feet. Her legs wobbled, but they held. "I'll ride," she said. Kyle nodded once and mounted the horse. He extended his hand again. This time when Clara took it, she noticed her fingers didn't shake quite as badly. They rode deeper into the canyon as the sun began its descent, painting the rocks in shades of blood and copper. Clara held on to Kyle's coat and tried not to think about what came next, because thinking meant confronting the fact that she'd just traded one form of captivity for complete uncertainty. But somewhere in the back of her mind, a thought began to take shape. Quiet, fragile, dangerous. For the first time in 22 years, nobody owned her. And she didn't know whether that meant freedom or just a different kind of falling. The canyon swallowed them whole as the sun bled out across the western rim. Clara had stopped counting the hours somewhere around the third ridge crossing when exhaustion turned time into something fluid and meaningless. Her back ached from the constant sway of the horse. Her arms felt like they'd been torn from the sockets, and every breath tasted like copper and dust. Kale hadn't spoken since they left the spot where he'd destroyed the contract. He just rode with the steady, mechanical focus of someone who'd made this journey 1,000 times and found nothing worth commenting on. Clara wanted to ask how much farther, wanted to demand rest, wanted to scream just to break the oppressive silence, but pride kept her jaw locked shut. She'd said she could handle this. Complaining 2 hours in would prove him right about her being soft. The landscape kept shifting around them like a fever dream. First, the scrubland gave way to narrow passes between towering red cliffs that blocked out the sky. Then the passes opened into basins filled with twisted juniper trees that looked dead until you got close enough to see the dark green needles. Twice they crossed shallow streams that appeared out of nowhere, the water so clear Clara could count the stones on the bottom. Cale let the horse drink from both, but didn't stop long enough for Clara to dismount. By the time full darkness hit, Clara's vision had started doing strange things, blurring at the edges, creating shapes in the shadows that disappeared when she looked directly at them. She blinked hard and tightened her grip on Kyle's coat, terrified she might fall asleep and slide right off the horse into the rocks below. "There," Cale said suddenly, the first word he'd spoken in hours. Clara forced her eyes to focus. Ahead of them, tucked against a cliff face like something trying to hide from the sky, was a structure. Calling it a cabin felt generous. It looked more like someone had stacked wood and stone together and hoped for the best. A single window glowed faintly with lamplight. Smoke curled from a chimney made of stacked rocks that seemed to defy gravity. "That's it?" The words slipped out before Clara could stop them. "You expecting a hotel?" Cale's voice was dry as the dust coating their clothes. "I wasn't expecting anything." Clara tried to inject some steel into her tone, but mostly just sounded exhausted. "It's fine. It's shelter. That's all it needs to be." They rode the last quarter mile in silence. As they got closer, Clara could make out more details. A corral to one side holding 3 horses, a shed that leaned like a drunk trying to stay upright, and what looked like the skeleton of a half-built barn. Everything about the place screamed isolation. This wasn't a ranch. It was a hiding spot. Kyle dismounted and helped Clara down. Her legs gave out immediately. She hit the ground hard, her palms scraping against stone, and lay there for a second trying to remember how bones were supposed to work. "You hurt?" Cale crouched beside her, his face shadowed. "Just tired." Clara pushed herself to her knees, then slowly, painfully, to her feet. Her entire body felt like it had been beaten with hammers. "I'm fine." "You're not, but we'll deal with that inside." Cale grabbed the horse's reins and led it toward the corral. "Go on in." Doors unlocked. Clara stood there swaying slightly, looking at the cabin like it might bite her. Every instinct she'd developed over the last month screamed not to walk into a strange man's house in the middle of nowhere with no witnesses and no way out. But the alternative was standing in the dark while her legs slowly gave up on the concept of standing, so she forced herself to move. The door opened with a creak that sounded like a scream in the silence. Inside, the cabin was smaller than it looked from outside. One main room with a fireplace, a rough wooden table, 2 chairs, and a cot shoved against the far wall. Shelves lined one wall, holding canned goods, ammunition boxes, and a few battered books. The air smelled like pine smoke and old coffee. Clara took 3 steps inside and stopped, suddenly aware that she was filthy, bleeding from where the rope burns had reopened, and wearing a dress that had turned into rags somewhere between Dead Horse Crossing and here. She looked like something the desert had chewed up and spit out. The door opened behind her. Kyle entered carrying saddlebags and a rifle, which he leaned against the wall near the door with the casual familiarity of someone who slept within reach of weapons. He glanced at Clara, then at the cot. "You take the bed. I'll sleep on the floor." "I can sleep on the floor," Clara said automatically. "You can barely stand on the floor." Kyle dropped the saddlebags and moved to the fireplace, where embers still glowed faintly. "Bed's not negotiable. Argue about something else if you need to fight." Clara wanted to argue anyway, just on principle, but her body staged a mutiny. She stumbled to the cot and sat down before her legs could quit entirely. The mattress was thin, the blanket rough, but it felt like the finest thing she'd ever touched. Cale worked on the fire, building it back up with practiced efficiency. Within minutes, flames were crackling and heat was spreading through the small space. He filled a pot with water from a barrel in the corner and hung it over the fire to boil. "When's the last time you ate?" he asked without turning around. Clara had to think about it. "Yesterday morning, they gave us bread. You need food." Kyle pulled a tin from one of the shelves and pried it open. "This is beans. They're not good, but they'll keep you alive." He dumped the beans into a second pot and set it near the fire. Then he grabbed a clean cloth from somewhere, soaked it in the now warm water, and crossed to where Clara sat. He held out the cloth. "Your wrists. Clean them before they get infected." Clara took the cloth and looked down at her wrists. The rope burns were angry red, crusted with dried blood and dirt. She pressed the warm cloth against one and hissed as pain shot up her arm. "Press harder," Kyle said. "Infection out here will kill you faster than anything else." Clara gritted her teeth and scrubbed at the wounds, biting back sounds of pain. Kyle watched for a moment, then turned back to the fire, apparently satisfied she wouldn't die of stubbornness in the next 5 minutes. The beans heated slowly. The silence stretched between them like a physical thing. Clara finished cleaning her wrists as best she could and set the cloth aside, studying Kyle's back while he stirred the pot. He'd taken off his coat, revealing a shirt that had probably been dark blue once but had faded to something closer to gray. His shoulders were broad enough to block most of the firelight, and when he moved, Clara could see the outline of scars through the thin fabric. "Why do you live out here?" The question emerged before Clara could stop it. Cale didn't turn around. "Because towns are full of people." "That's not an answer." "It's the only one you're getting tonight." He pulled the pot off the fire and divided the beans between 2 tin plates. He handed one to Clara along with a bent spoon. "Eat." The beans were tasteless and slightly burned, but Clara's stomach didn't care. She shoveled food into her mouth with the desperation of someone who'd forgotten what full felt like. Kyle ate standing up, his eyes occasionally moving to the window like he expected company. Clara finished her plate and set it aside, her stomach finally quiet for the first time in days. Exhaustion hit her like a physical blow. Her eyes started closing on their own. "Sleep," Cale said. He collected the plates and dumped them in a bucket. "We'll talk in the morning." "Talk about what?" Clara forced her eyes open. "What happens next? But not tonight. Tonight you're half dead, and half dead people make bad decisions." He grabbed a blanket from a shelf and tossed it to her. "Get some rest." Clara wanted to argue, wanted to demand answers, wanted to know what the hell she was doing in a canyon with a man who'd bought her freedom by entering a lottery designed to destroy women. Instead, she lay down on the cot, pulled the blanket over herself, and was asleep before Cale finished banking the fire. She dreamed of platforms and ropes and men with coins for eyes. Morning came too fast and too bright. Clara woke to sunlight stabbing through the window directly into her face and the smell of coffee so strong it could wake the dead. Every muscle in her body screamed in protest as she sat up. She felt like she'd been trampled by horses and then reassembled by someone who'd never seen a human before. Cale was already awake, sitting at the table cleaning a rifle with methodical precision. A pot of coffee sat on the edge of the fireplace, and someone, presumably Kyle, had left a tin cup on the floor beside the cot. "There's coffee," he said without looking up from the rifle. "Water's in the barrel if you want to wash." Clara stood slowly, testing each joint to make sure it still functioned. She poured coffee into the cup and took a sip. It was thick enough to stand a spoon in and tasted like battery acid, but the heat and caffeine hit her system like a blessing. She caught sight of herself in a cracked mirror hanging near the door and almost didn't recognize the woman staring back. Her hair looked like a rat's nest. Her face was sunburned and streaked with dirt, and her dress was torn in 3 places she hadn't noticed in the dark. She looked feral. "There's a creek about 50 yards west," Kyle said, apparently reading her mind. "Water's cold but clean. You want to wash up? Now's the time." Clara glanced at him, then at the door. "You're just going to let me walk out there alone? You planning on running?" Cale looked up from the rifle, his eyes flat. "Because if you are, I should mention the nearest town that isn't Dead Horse Crossing is 4 days north on foot, and you'd die of exposure before you made it halfway. But you're welcome to try." "I wasn't planning on running." Clara's voice came out sharper than intended. "I was just surprised you'd trust me." "I don't trust you. I just know the math." Cale returned to his rifle. "Creek's that way. Watch for snakes." Clara grabbed the least filthy cloth she could find and walked out into the morning. The air was already heating up, promising another day of brutal sun, but for now it was almost pleasant. She found the creek exactly where Cale said it would be, a narrow ribbon of water cutting through red rock, so cold it made her teeth ache when she splashed it on her face. She stripped down to her underclothes and washed as best she could, scrubbing away layers of dirt and sweat and the psychic residue of being sold like livestock. The water was so cold it hurt, but the pain felt cleansing. By the time she finished, her skin was pink and her fingers were numb, but she felt almost human again. When she made it back to the cabin, Kyle had finished with the rifle and moved on to sharpening a knife. He glanced up as she entered, his eyes doing a quick assessment, checking for injury or problems, nothing more. "Better?" he asked. "Less likely to attract vultures," Clara said. Something that might have been amusement flickered across Kyle's face, but it was gone before Clara could be sure. He set the knife down and leaned back in his chair. "We need to talk about your situation." Clara sat in the other chair, her wet hair dripping onto her shoulders. "What situation? You tore up the contract. I'm not legally anybody's wife." "Legal doesn't mean much out here," Kyle said. "That contract might be gone, but the men who think they have a claim on you aren't. Dead Horse Crossing runs on corruption. Someone's going to come looking, trying to drag you back." "Let them try." The words came out with more bravado than Clara felt. "You know how to shoot a gun?" "No." "Track someone through canyon country?" "No." "Survive more than 3 days alone in the wilderness?" Clara glared at him. "I'm starting to see your point. My point is you're not ready to defend yourself, and sitting in my cabin won't prepare you." Cale stood and walked to the shelves, pulling down a box of ammunition. "You want to survive out here, really survive, not just exist. You need to learn skills the preacher's daughter never needed." "So what? You're going to teach me?" Clara tried to keep the skepticism out of her voice and failed. "I'm going to give you the option to learn. What you do with that option is your business." Kyle loaded bullets into the rifle with smooth, practiced movements. "But understand this. The canyon doesn't care about your history or your manners or whatever soft life you had before. It'll kill you without hesitation if you're not prepared. I can show you how not to die. Whether you listen is up to you." Clara studied him across the small room. This man who'd entered a lottery to save a stranger, who'd torn up a legal document and offered shelter to someone he had no obligation to help, who was now proposing to teach her survival skills like it was the most natural thing in the world. "Why?" she asked. "Why are you doing any of this?" Cale was quiet for a moment, his hands still on the rifle. When he spoke, his voice was carefully neutral. "I told you about my sister. What I didn't tell you was that I spent 5 years after her death hunting the men responsible, found every single one of them, made sure they understood exactly what they'd taken from the world." He looked at Clara directly. "I can't bring her back, but I can make sure other women have the chance she didn't, the chance to fight back." Clara's throat tightened. "I'm not a fighter." "You are. You just don't know it yet." Kyle slung the rifle over his shoulder. "Come on. First lesson starts now." He walked out without waiting for a response. Clara sat there for 5 seconds, weighing her options. She could stay in the cabin, safe and useless, or she could walk into the burning sun and let a dangerous man teach her how to be dangerous right back. She stood and followed him outside. Kyle led her to a flat area behind the cabin where the ground was packed hard and clear of vegetation. He set up a row of tin cans on a fallen log about 20 yards away, then turned to Clara and held out a revolver. "This is a Colt 45, 6 shots. It'll kick hard enough to break your wrist if you're not ready for it, and the noise will make your ears ring for an hour." He demonstrated the proper grip, his hands moving with the casual competence of long familiarity. "You ever held a gun before?" "My father kept a hunting rifle, but he never let me touch it." "Your father was a fool." Cale placed the revolver in her hands. "Feel the weight, get used to it." The gun was heavier than Clara expected, solid and cold. It felt alien in her grip, like holding a piece of violence made tangible. "Now, stance." Kyle moved behind her, adjusting her feet with his boot. Shoulder width apart, knees slightly bent. "You want to be stable because this thing will try to throw you backward." His hands guided her arms into position, left hand supporting the right, elbows locked but not rigid. "See those cans?" "Yes." "Pick one. Just one. Don't try to hit all of them. Focus on a single target." Clara chose the middle can and tried to aim, but her hands were shaking so badly the barrel kept drifting. "You're thinking too much," Kael said from behind her. "It's just metal and mechanics. Point it where you want the bullet to go, squeeze the trigger slowly, don't pull, squeeze, and let the gun do its job." "What if I miss?" "Then you miss. Bullets are cheaper than coffins. Fire when ready." Clara took a breath, held it, and squeezed the trigger. The world exploded. The gun kicked back so hard it nearly flew out of her hands. The sound was a physical assault on her eardrums, and smoke bloomed in front of her face. When the chaos cleared, all 6 cans were still standing, completely unharmed. "I missed," Clara said, her voice small. "You also didn't drop the gun or shoot yourself in the foot, so I'm calling that a win." Cale took the revolver and reloaded it. Again. "This time don't close your eyes." "I didn't close my eyes." "You absolutely did. Try again." They spent the next 2 hours in that clearing, Clara firing until her arms ached and her hands were numb, and her ears were ringing so loud she could barely hear Kael's instructions. She missed 43 times. On the 44th shot, she finally hit a can, sending it spinning off the log. The rush of satisfaction was so intense Clara almost dropped the gun. "There you go," Kael said, and there was something in his voice that might have been pride. "Do that 5 more times, and you might actually survive an encounter." By the time they finished, the sun was directly overhead, and Clara was covered in sweat and gunpowder residue. Her hands were shaking from exhaustion, her ears were still ringing, and she'd only managed to hit 3 cans total out of maybe 70 shots. But something had shifted inside her. The gun no longer felt quite so foreign. The violence felt less abstract. They walked back to the cabin in silence. Kyle went inside and returned with 2 canteens of water. He tossed one to Clara. "Drink! You're dehydrated." Clara drained half the canteen in one long pull, then splashed some of the water on her face. "What's next? Knife fighting? Setting traps?" "Next, you rest. Learning too much too fast will get you killed just as sure as learning nothing." Kyle sat on the ground with his back against the cabin wall, his eyes scanning the horizon. "Tomorrow I'll teach you how to read the land. Day after that, tracking. And then what?" Clara sat beside him, her muscles already starting to stiffen. "I just stay here forever, learning survival skills and pretending Dead Horse Crossing doesn't exist?" "No. Eventually you'll have to decide what you're surviving for." Kale's voice was quiet. "Running, hiding, rebuilding, those are all choices. But you can't make them until you're strong enough that they're actually choices instead of just different ways to die." Clara was quiet for a moment, turning his words over in her mind. "What did you choose after your sister?" "Revenge first, then isolation." Kale's eyes were distant, looking at something Clara couldn't see. "Can't say I recommend either path, but they kept me breathing when breathing felt impossible." "Do you regret it?" "Every day." He stood, brushing dust from his pants. "But regret doesn't change the past. It just makes the present heavier. Come on. You should eat something before you collapse." They spent the rest of the afternoon in the cabin. Kyle showed Clara how to properly clean a gun, how to identify which canned goods had gone bad, how to read the weather by watching the color of the sky. Practical knowledge, survival knowledge, the kind of education her father had never thought a preacher's daughter needed. As evening approached, Clara found herself standing at the cabin's single window, looking out at the canyon that stretched endlessly in all directions. The red rocks glowed in the fading light, beautiful and merciless. "It's strange," she said softly. "3 days ago, I was on a platform being sold to the highest bidder. Now I'm standing in a canyon learning how to shoot. It doesn't feel real." "That's because your brain hasn't caught up yet." Kyle was at the table behind her, working on some kind of leather repair. "Give it time. Eventually, what happened will stop feeling like a nightmare and start feeling like a scar, permanent but survivable." "Is that what your sister's death feels like to you? A scar?" Kale's hand stopped moving. For a long moment, he didn't respond, and Clara thought maybe she'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. But then he spoke, his voice careful and controlled. "It feels like an amputation. Part of me got cut off, and the rest of me had to figure out how to function anyway. Some days are better than others." He resumed his work. "But I'm still here, still breathing. That counts for something." Clara turned from the window. "I'm sorry. For what happened to her. For all of it." "Save your sorry. It doesn't help anyone." Kyle's tone wasn't cruel, just factual. "What helps is making sure the same thing doesn't happen to someone else. That's why I pulled you off that platform. That's why I'm teaching you how to fight back." "You can't save everyone," Clara said quietly. "No, but I can save the one standing right in front of me." He looked up, meeting her eyes. "And right now? That's you." Something passed between them in that moment. Not romance, not even friendship exactly. Recognition, maybe. Two people who'd both lost something fundamental and were trying to figure out how to exist in the aftermath. The moment broke when a sound cut through the evening quiet. Hoofbeats. Multiple horses, moving fast. Kyle was on his feet instantly, the rifle in his hands before Clara could even process what was happening. He moved to the window, his body tense. "Get away from the glass," he said quietly. Clara pressed herself against the wall, her heart suddenly trying to punch through her ribs. "Who is it?" "Don't know yet. But nobody comes out here by accident." Cale's eyes tracked something Clara couldn't see. 3 riders, armed. "They're slowing down." "Dead horse crossing?" "Probably." Fear spiked through Clara's chest, sharp and immediate. They'd found her, already. She'd had less than 48 hours of something resembling freedom, and now it was over. "What do we do?" Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "We?" Cale glanced at her, something hard in his expression. "You hide. I talk. Like hell, if they're here for me, then you being visible just confirms you're here. Get in the back corner, stay quiet, and let me handle this." Cale moved toward the door. "And Clara? If shooting starts, you hit the floor and stay there. Understand?" Clara wanted to argue, wanted to grab a gun and stand beside him, wanted to prove she wasn't the helpless woman they'd tried to sell. But she also wasn't stupid. She'd hit 3 cans out of 70 shots. She'd be more liability than help. She moved to the back corner of the cabin, pressing herself into the shadows. Kyle opened the door and stepped outside, the rifle held casually but ready. Clara couldn't see what was happening, but she could hear voices through the thin walls. "Kyle Varick," a man's voice, rough and arrogant. "Heard you won yourself a wife in Dead Horse Crossing. That true?" "Heard lots of things." Kyle's voice was flat, emotionless. "Most of them are lies." "See, that's interesting, because Mayor Hutchins sent us out here with a message. Says you took something that belongs to the town. Says there's a legal contract that needs enforcing. I burned that contract 2 days ago. Hutchins knows it, which means you're not here on official business. You're here because someone paid you to drag a woman back in chains." A pause. "That about right?" Someone else spoke, younger, meaner. "You calling us liars? I'm calling you what you are. Thugs pretending to be lawmen." The sound of metal on metal. Cale cocking the rifle. "Now you've got about 10 seconds to turn those horses around before this conversation gets unpleasant." "There's 3 of us and 1 of you," the first man said. "You sure you want to play this game?" "You're assuming I'm alone." Cale's voice dropped lower. Dangerous. Bad assumption. Silence. Clara's heart hammered so loud she was sure they could hear it through the walls. She looked around for a weapon, anything, and her eyes landed on the revolver Kyle had left on the table. She grabbed it, her hands shaking. "We're taking the girl," the first man said finally. "One way or another." "Then I guess it's another." The gunshot was so loud Clara felt it in her bones. She hit the floor instinctively, the revolver clutched against her chest. More shots followed, A rapid exchange that sounded like the world ending. Horses screamed. Men shouted. Something hit the cabin wall hard enough to make the whole structure shudder. Then silence. Clara lay on the floor, barely breathing, waiting for the door to crash open and hands to drag her into the sunlight. Instead, she heard Kyl's voice, calm and cold. Your friend's dead, the other one's running. You want to join him, or you want to bleed out in my yard arguing about contracts? A pained groan. You shot me, you bastard! You came here planning to kidnap a woman. I'd say you got off light. The sound of footsteps. Get on your horse. Tell Hutchins and whoever paid you that Clara Whitmore isn't leaving this canyon. If they send more men, I'll send them back in pieces. We clear? This isn't over. It is for you. Ride. Hoofbeats faded into the distance. Clara stayed on the floor, her entire body shaking, the gun still pressed against her ribs. The door opened and Kyle stepped inside, blood on his shirt, his eyes cold and flat. He looked at Clara on the floor, at the gun in her hands, and something shifted in his expression. You okay? He asked. Clara nodded, not trusting her voice. Did you load that gun, or are you planning to throw it at the next person who threatens you? Clara looked down at the revolver. She had no idea if it was loaded. She'd just grabbed it out of panic and instinct. Kyle crossed the room and gently took the gun from her hands. He checked the cylinder, empty, and set it on the table. Then he crouched beside Clara, his eyes searching her face. They're gone. For now. For now, Clara repeated. Her voice sounded strange, distant. They'll come back. Probably. And next time there might be more of them. Probably. Clara looked up at him, this man covered in someone else's blood who'd just killed to keep her safe. What happens when they send 10 men? 20? Cale was quiet for a moment. Then he stood and offered her his hand. Then we make sure you're ready to fight beside me instead of hiding in corners. Clara stared at his outstretched hand, scarred, blood-stained, offering something she couldn't quite name. She thought about the platform in Dead Horse Crossing, the ropes on her wrists, the men who believed they could buy and sell human beings like cattle. She thought about the gun in her hands, empty but present. The 3 cans she'd managed to hit, the canyon that demanded strength instead of obedience. She took Kyle's hand and let him pull her to her feet. Then I guess we'd better get started, she said. And somewhere deep in her chest, beneath the fear and exhaustion and lingering terror, something sharp and fierce began to wake up. The body was still cooling in the dirt when Kyle handed Clara a shovel. We bury him before the vultures come, he said, already walking toward the corpse sprawled 20 feet from the cabin. Canyon gets hot. Dead things don't keep. Clara stared at the shovel in her hands, then at the man lying face down in the dust with a bullet hole through his spine. She'd never seen a dead person before. Not like this, fresh and violent and real. Her father had been laid out peaceful in a coffin, hands folded, looking almost asleep. This man looked like what he was, meat that had stopped working. I don't know if I can, she said quietly. You don't have to dig, but you're going to watch. Cale drove his own shovel into the hard ground with a sound like breaking bone. Death is part of surviving out here. You need to get comfortable with it. Clara forced herself to walk closer. The man was maybe 30, with a thick beard and hands that looked like they'd broken things for fun. One of his eyes was still open, staring at nothing. She felt her stomach lurch and had to look away. Who was he? She asked. Does it matter? Cale's shovel bit into the earth again, levering up rocks and compacted dirt. He came here to drag you back in chains. Now he's dead. That's the whole story. It matters to me. Cale paused, leaning on his shovel. Sweat was already darkening his shirt. Name was Pete Hendricks. Used to work security for the mining company before it went under. After that, he drifted into bounty work, collecting debts, breaking fingers when people couldn't pay. He went back to digging. He wasn't a good man, Clara. Don't waste sympathy on him. I'm not sympathizing. I just want to know who died because of me. He died because of his own choices. You were just the excuse. Cale's voice was flat, factual. Now either help dig or go back inside. Standing there staring won't change anything. Clara gripped the shovel tighter and started digging beside him. The ground was brutal, packed clay and stone that barely yielded to the blade. Within minutes, her hands were blistering, her shoulders screaming, sweat pouring down her face. But she kept digging because Kael was right. Death was part of this now. She needed to learn how to stand in its presence without falling apart. They dug in silence for over an hour, the hole growing deeper by inches. When it was finally deep enough, Kael climbed out and rolled Hendrik's body into the grave without ceremony. The corpse landed with a wet thump that Clara felt in her bones. "Shouldn't we say something?" she asked. "Like what?" Kael started shoveling dirt back into the hole. He lived violent, died violent, and now he's dirt. There's nothing left to say. They filled the grave as the sun began its descent, painting the canyon walls in shades of copper and blood. When the last shovelful of earth was packed down, Kael marked the spot with a flat stone and walked away without looking back. Clara stood there a moment longer staring at the unmarked grave. A man had died today because he tried to take her freedom. She should feel something, guilt, horror, satisfaction, anything. Instead, she just felt hollow, like someone had scooped out her insides and left her standing there empty. "You coming?" Kael called from the cabin door. Clara turned away from the grave and walked toward the light spilling from the open door. Behind her, the canyon was already swallowing Pete Hendricks like he'd never existed at all. The next morning, Kael woke Clara before dawn with a boot to the cot frame. "Get up, we're riding out." Clara sat up, her body one massive bruise. "Where?" "May Carter's place. She lives about 3 hours east. You need to meet her." "Why?" "Because I can teach you how to shoot and track and not die from dehydration," Kael said, already moving around the cabin gathering supplies. "But there are things a woman needs to learn from another woman. May's survived out here longer than anyone I know. If she's willing to talk to you, listen." They left within the hour, riding through the pre-dawn darkness with only starlight to guide them. Kael led, Clara followed, and the canyon slowly revealed itself as the sun climbed, massive rock formations that looked like frozen waves, narrow passes barely wide enough for a horse, and stretches of flat land where nothing grew except defiance. Clara had gotten better at riding over the past week. Not good, but better. She could stay in the saddle for hours now without feeling like her spine was trying to escape her body. The landscape was starting to make sense, too. She could recognize landmarks, read the way water had carved patterns into stone, understand why certain paths were safer than others. "Tell me about May," she said, as they navigated a narrow ridge with a 200-foot drop on one side. "She's hard," Kael said without turning around. "Harder than me, which is saying something. She was in a bride lottery 8 years ago. Different town, same corruption. The man who won her tried to break her. Didn't work. What happened to him? She shot him in his sleep and burned the house down around him. Then she came out here and built a life where nobody could touch her." Kael guided his horse around a boulder. "She doesn't trust easy, and she's got no patience for weakness. But if she decides you're worth teaching, you'll learn things I can't show you." They rode in silence after that, the sun climbing higher, the heat building like pressure in a closed fist. Around mid-morning, they crested a ridge and Clara saw a homestead tucked into a valley below, a cabin similar to Kael's but larger, with a garden plot that actually looked productive, a chicken coop, and a corral holding goats instead of horses. A woman stood in front of the cabin, rifle in hand, watching them descend. She was maybe 40, maybe older, with gray-streaked black hair pulled back tight and a face that looked like it had been carved from the same stone as the canyon. She wore men's clothes and moved with the easy confidence of someone who'd forgotten how to be afraid. Kael raised one hand in greeting as they approached. "May." "Kael." May's eyes moved to Clara, sharp and assessing. "This the lottery girl?" "Name's Clara," Clara said before Kael could answer. May's eyebrows rose slightly. "Got some spine then. Good. Spineless women don't last out here." She lowered the rifle but didn't set it aside. "Why'd you bring her to me?" "Because she needs to learn, and I'm not qualified to teach her everything." Kael dismounted and Clara followed. "Figure you could show her what she needs to know." "And what makes you think I want a student?" May's voice was flat, challenging. "Because you were where she is 8 years ago," Kael said quietly, "and someone helped you. Pay it forward." May was silent for a long moment, her eyes locked on Kael's face. Then she looked at Clara again, taking her apart piece by piece with a gaze that felt like being dissected. "You know how to gut a chicken?" May asked suddenly. Clara blinked. "What?" "Gut a chicken. Kill it, pluck it, clean it, cook it. Can you do that?" "No." Can you sew a wound without fainting? I don't know. I've never tried. Can you fight off a man twice your size who's trying to pin you down? Clara's jaw tightened. Not yet. Not yet, May repeated. Something shifted in her expression, not quite approval, but close. At least you're honest. Most women show up out here thinking they're tougher than they are. Gets them killed. She turned to Kale. How long are you planning to leave her? 3 days. That enough time? To teach her everything she needs? No. To teach her enough that she won't die stupid? Maybe. May finally set the rifle aside. Come on then, girl. Let's see what you're made of. Kyle left without ceremony, riding back the way they'd come as Clara watched him disappear into the canyon. She felt suddenly exposed, standing in front of this hard-faced woman who looked at her like a problem to be solved. First rule, May said. Out here, nobody's coming to save you. Not Kyle, not me, not anyone. You survive or you don't, and that's entirely on you. Understand? Yes. Good. Second rule. Forget everything you learned about being a lady. Manners won't stop a rattlesnake from biting. Modesty won't help you when you're starving. Out here, you're not a preacher's daughter, or a lottery prize, or anything else. You're just a person trying to stay alive. Can you accept that? Clara thought about the platform in Dead Horse Crossing, the ropes on her wrists, Pete Hendricks cooling in an unmarked grave. I can. Then we start now. Follow me. May led Clara behind the cabin where a chicken coop stood in the shade. She reached in and pulled out a hen with practiced ease, holding it by the legs as it squawked and flapped. You're going to kill this bird, May said, handing it to Clara. Wring its neck, quick and clean. Clara held the chicken, feeling its heart hammering against her palms, its feathers soft and alive. She'd eaten chicken 100 times, but never thought about the killing part. Someone else had always done that, somewhere she didn't have to see. I don't know how, she admitted. It's not complicated. Hold the body in one hand, the head in the other, and twist hard. Neck breaks, bird dies, you've got dinner. May watched Clara's hesitation with eyes that showed no sympathy. This is what survival looks like. Not pretty, not noble, just necessary. Clara gripped the chicken's head in her right hand, the body in her left. The bird thrashed, desperate. She could feel its panic vibrating through her fingers. Do it, May said. Clara twisted. There was a crack, a final spasm, and then the chicken went limp. Dead. She'd killed something with her bare hands. Good, May said. Now, pluck it. They spent the next hour preparing the bird, pulling feathers, gutting the cavity, removing organs Clara had no names for. May narrated each step in a clinical voice, explaining what was edible and what wasn't, how to tell if meat had gone bad, how to preserve what you couldn't eat immediately. By the time they were done, Clara's hands were covered in blood and feathers, and she'd thrown up twice behind the coop. You did better than I expected, May said, washing her hands in a bucket. Most women cry the first time. You just puked and kept working. Should I be proud of that? Clara's voice was sharp. You should be realistic about what it means. Survival isn't about being proud. It's about being willing to do what needs doing, even when it makes you sick. May dried her hands on a rag. Come on, next lesson. Over the next 3 days, May taught Clara things the preacher's daughter had never imagined needing. How to set snares for rabbits. How to identify which plants were edible and which would kill you. How to clean and dress a wound using nothing but whiskey and thread. How to move quietly through brush without leaving obvious tracks. But the hardest lessons had nothing to do with practical skills. On the second day, May took Clara to a clearing and handed her a knife. You're going to learn how to fight, May said. Not shoot. Kale's teaching you that. I mean close quarters. The kind of fighting that happens when someone's got their hands on you and a gun won't help. She demonstrated holds, breaks, the vulnerable points on a human body where even a small woman could inflict serious damage. Eyes, throat, groin, joints. She showed Clara how to turn an attacker's strength against them, how to break a grip, how to create distance when there was none. Then she attacked. Clara hit the ground hard, May's knee on her chest, a training knife pressed against her throat. You're dead, May said flatly. What did you do wrong? I wasn't fast enough. No, you hesitated. You saw me coming and your brain wasted time being afraid instead of reacting. May pulled back and hauled Clara to her feet. Fear will get you killed faster than anything else. You need to learn how to move through it, not around it. Again. They repeated the drill 20 times. Clara got better, faster, started seeing the openings May left deliberately. She managed to break one hold, dodge 2 strikes, and land a knee that would have ended the fight if it had connected with actual force. May seemed almost pleased. You're learning. Most women out here die because they can't imagine being violent. You're starting to see it's just another tool. That night, sitting by May's fire eating stew made from the chicken Clara had killed, May spoke in a voice quiet enough that Clara had to lean in to hear. The man who won me in the lottery, his name was Cyrus Wade. He liked hurting things. Animals first, then people when he got the chance. May stared into the flames. He bought me thinking I'd be easy to break. Kept me chained in his barn for 3 weeks trying to make me compliant. Clara's throat tightened. What changed? I realized he was going to kill me eventually, whether I obeyed or not. Men like that don't want wives. They want victims. So I decided if I was going to die anyway, it might as well be on my terms. May's eyes reflected firelight. Took me 2 months to plan. Another month to get him drunk enough that he slept heavy. Then I used the kitchen knife on his throat and watched him bleed out on the floor he'd beaten me on. Were you scared? Clara asked quietly. Terrified. But I was more scared of staying, of letting him turn me into something I couldn't recognize. May looked at Clara directly. You understand what I'm telling you? The lottery, the contracts, the men who think they own you, that's all just different flavors of the same poison. You either spit it out or it kills you from the inside. Kael said you burned the house down. I did. Wanted to make sure nobody could claim Cyrus just had an accident. Wanted everyone to know someone fought back. May poked at the fire with a stick. That's when I came out here. Built this place, learned to survive, and made damn sure nobody would ever put chains on me again. Do you regret it, killing him? May was quiet for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady. I regret that it was necessary. I don't regret doing it. There's a difference. On the 3rd day, May took Clara to the edge of her property, where the land dropped away into a deep ravine. You see that ledge across the gap? May pointed to a rock outcropping about 8 feet away, separated by a 20-foot drop. You're going to jump to it. Clara looked at the distance, the drop, the sharp rocks at the bottom. That's suicide. It's about 3 feet farther than you think you can jump, May said, which means your brain is telling you it's impossible, but your legs can make it. The question is whether you trust yourself more than you trust your fear. And if I fall? Then you die. And I have to explain to Kael why I let his project break her neck on my watch. May's tone was matter of fact. But you won't fall. You're stronger than you think. You just haven't proved it to yourself yet. Clara stared at the gap. Every rational part of her brain screamed that this was insane, that May was testing her for some cruel reason, that jumping would end with her body shattered on rocks far below. But another part, the part that had twisted a chicken's neck, that had buried a man, that had started to see violence as a tool instead of a nightmare. That part was curious about what would happen if she tried. Back up about 10 feet, May instructed. Get a running start. Don't think about the gap. Just run and jump like the ground doesn't end. Clara backed up. Her heart was slamming against her ribs. Her hands were shaking. Every muscle in her body was screaming at her to walk away. She ran. Her boots hammered the ground, the edge rushing toward her, and for one crystalline moment, Clara's brain showed her every way this could go wrong. Her foot slipping, her jump falling short, her body tumbling into empty air. Then she was airborne, flying over the gap, the ravine yawning beneath her like an open mouth. She hit the far ledge hard, her knees slamming into stone, her hands scrabbling for purchase. For one terrible second, she thought she'd slide backward into the void, but her fingers found a crack, her other foot caught the edge, and she hauled herself onto solid ground. She lay there gasping, her entire body shaking, alive and terrified, and exhilarated all at once. Across the gap, May nodded once. Now jump back. You're insane, Clara shouted. Maybe, but you just proved you can do impossible things. Come on, this time you know you'll make it. The second jump was somehow harder. Knowing she could do it meant knowing there was no excuse if she failed, but Clara backed up, ran, and launched herself over the ravine again. This time she landed cleaner, rolling to absorb the impact like May had taught her. May pulled her to her feet. "How do you feel?" Clara wanted to say, terrified. She wanted to say angry at being pushed this hard. Instead, what came out was, alive. "Good. Remember that feeling, because that's what you're fighting for. Not survival. That's too abstract. You're fighting to feel alive instead of buried." May started walking back toward the cabin. "Kael will be here in a few hours. Let's get you cleaned up so you don't look like you've been through a war." When Kael arrived that afternoon, Clara was sitting on May's porch cleaning a rifle. She'd borrowed clothes from May, pants that fit better than her ruined dress, a shirt that didn't restrict her movement, boots that wouldn't fall apart after a week of hard use. She looked different. She felt different. Kael dismounted and studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. "She survived you?" he asked May. "Barely," May said dryly, "but she's got potential. Doesn't faint at blood. Doesn't quit when things get hard. Give her 6 months and she might actually be dangerous." "I don't have 6 months," Clara said, standing. "Dead Horse Crossing won't wait that long." "No, they won't," Kael agreed, "which is why we need to talk. Something's happened." They went inside, and Kael laid out what he'd learned while Clara was training. 2 more men had come to his canyon looking for her, bounty hunters this time, carrying wanted posters with her name and a reward of $200. Kael had sent them away with warnings, but the message was clear. Dead Horse Crossing wanted her back badly enough to spread money around. "It's not just Hutchins anymore," Kael said. One of the hunters mentioned a name, Elias Boone. May's face went hard. "Boone's involved?" "You know him?" Clara asked. "Everyone knows him," May said. "He's got mines, property, half the territory in his pocket. If Boone's put money on your head, this just got a lot more complicated." "Who is he?" Clara demanded. Kael and May exchanged a look. Finally, Kael spoke. "Elias Boone was one of the 36 men in the lottery. He paid triple the normal entry fee because he wanted to make sure he got you specifically. When I won instead, he lost a lot of money and even more pride." Kael's voice was grim. "Men like Boone don't handle that kind of humiliation well." "So what does that mean?" It means he's not going to stop. He'll send more men, offer bigger rewards, pull strings until either you're dragged back or someone dies trying." Kael leaned against the wall. "We need to decide how to handle this. You can run, try to make it to another territory where his influence doesn't reach, or you can fight." "If she runs, they'll chase her forever," May said. "Men like Boone are obsessed with ownership. He won't let it go." "And if I fight?" Clara asked. "Then we make it clear you're not available to be claimed," Kael said. "We send a message loud enough that even Boone can't ignore it." "What kind of message?" Kael's eyes were cold. "The permanent kind." Clara stood in May's cabin, looking at these 2 people who'd become her unlikely allies. A week ago, she'd been a terrified woman on a platform, waiting to be sold. Now she was standing in the wilderness, wearing borrowed clothes and learning to kill, discussing how to handle a powerful man who thought he owned her. The old Clara, the preacher's daughter, would have run, would have found the nearest town with a church and begged for sanctuary, hoping someone would protect her. But that Clara was dead, buried somewhere between Dead Horse Crossing and the canyon in an unmarked grave beside Pete Hendricks. "I'm not running," she said quietly. "If Boone wants me, he can come get me himself. And we'll see how that works out for him." May smiled, sharp and predatory. "Now you're starting to sound like a survivor." Kael nodded once. "Then we prepare. Boone won't come himself. He'll send others first. We need to be ready." They spent the rest of the afternoon planning, laying out strategies and contingencies, preparing for a fight that was coming whether they wanted it or not. As the sun set and shadows filled the canyon, Clara felt something settling in her chest. Not peace exactly, but purpose. She'd been sold, stolen, hunted, and threatened. Now she was going to fight back. And whoever came for her next was going to learn exactly what happened when you tried to cage something that had already tasted freedom. The ride back to Kael's canyon took them through the night. Clara rode beside him this time instead of behind, her borrowed rifle across her lap, her eyes scanning the darkness for threats. May had given her the weapon with simple instructions. You see someone who doesn't belong, you shoot first and ask questions after they're dead. When they finally reached the cabin, both of them were exhausted and wired with adrenaline. Kael lit a fire while Clara checked the perimeter like he'd taught her, looking for tracks, disturbed ground, anything that suggested visitors. She found boot prints near the corral, fresh, maybe 3 hours old. Kael, she called quietly. He was beside her in seconds, reading the tracks in the moonlight. His jaw tightened. They're getting bolder, coming closer while we're gone. He straightened and looked at Clara. From now on, one of us stays here at all times. They want to make you think you're not safe anywhere. I'm not safe anywhere, Clara said. That's the point. No, the point is they think you're alone and weak. We're going to prove them wrong. Kael headed back toward the cabin. Get some sleep. Tomorrow we start fortifying this place. If they want a siege, we'll give them one. Clara stood in the dark, looking at the boot prints pressed into the dirt. Somewhere out there, men were planning how to take her, how to drag her back, how to break her. She thought about May's words. You're fighting to feel alive instead of buried. Clara walked back to the cabin, where firelight spilled warm and golden from the open door. Inside, Kael was cleaning his rifle with the methodical patience of someone who'd done it 1,000 times. She sat across from him and started cleaning her own weapon. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. The war was coming, and Clara Whitmore was finally ready to meet it. They came 6 days later, just after dawn, when the light was still gray and uncertain. Clara was checking the snares they'd set along the northern ridge when she heard the first gunshot crack through the canyon like a branch snapping. She dropped flat on instinct, her hand going to the revolver at her hip, adrenaline slamming through her veins so hard she could taste copper. 2 more shots followed in quick succession. Then Kael's voice, distant but clear. Clara, get back here. She ran. The terrain she'd been carefully navigating for the past hour became a blur of rocks and scrub brush as she sprinted back toward the cabin. Her lungs burned, her boots slipped on loose stone, but she didn't slow down. More gunfire erupted ahead. A sustained exchange that meant multiple shooters. When she crested the final ridge and saw the cabin below, her stomach dropped. 5 riders surrounded the homestead, using the rocks and the half-built barn as cover. Kael was pinned inside the cabin, returning fire through the window, but he was alone and outnumbered. Even as Clara watched, one of the riders circled around toward the back where Kyle's blind spot was. Clara's brain went cold and calculating in a way that would have terrified her a week ago. She had maybe 30 seconds before that rider reached the back door. Kael wouldn't see him coming until it was too late. She dropped to one knee behind a boulder, pulled her revolver, and aimed at the circling rider. Her hands were steady. May's voice echoed in her head. Don't think, just shoot. Clara squeezed the trigger. The shot went wide, kicking up dirt 3 feet to the rider's left. He jerked in his saddle, looking around for the source. Clara adjusted her aim, exhaled slowly, and fired again. This time the bullet caught the man's horse in the flank. The animal screamed and reared, throwing its rider hard into the rocks. The man hit the ground and didn't move. The other riders turned, trying to locate this new threat. Clara was already moving, scrambling along the ridge to a different position, the way Kael had taught her. Stay mobile. Never shoot from the same spot twice. She found cover behind a twisted juniper and took aim at another rider. She fired 3 times, 2 misses and 1 hit that caught the man in the shoulder and spun him sideways in his saddle. He cursed loud enough for Clara to hear and wheeled his horse away from the cabin, clutching his bleeding arm. There's another one, someone shouted. Up on the ridge. Bullets started chewing into the rocks around Clara's position. She pressed herself flat, her heart hammering, chunks of stone exploding inches from her face. This was different from target practice with tin cans. This was chaos and violence and the very real possibility of dying in the next few seconds. But beneath the fear, something else was rising, something fierce and sharp that didn't want to hide anymore. Clara rolled to her left, came up in a crouch, and fired twice more at the riders regrouping near the corral. She didn't hit anyone, but it forced them to scatter, breaking their assault on the cabin. Kael used the distraction. He kicked open the cabin door and came out firing, his rifle speaking in sharp, deliberate cracks. One rider went down immediately, tumbling from his horse with a scream. Another tried to return fire, but Kael was already moving, using the terrain, making himself a difficult target. The remaining riders realized they were caught between 2 shooters with high ground and training. One of them, a big man with a scar across his face, shouted something Clara couldn't hear, and the survivors broke for open ground, abandoning their wounded. Clara tracked the scarred man with her revolver, squeezed the trigger, and heard only a click. Empty. She'd burned through all 6 shots without even counting. The riders disappeared into the canyon, leaving behind 3 bodies and 1 wounded man who was trying to crawl toward his fallen horse. Kyle walked over and kicked the man's gun away, then pressed his boot against the man's back to keep him pinned. "Clara," Cale's voice cut through the ringing in her ears. "You hit?" "No!" She stood on shaking legs and started picking her way down the ridge, reloading as she moved. Her hands were trembling now, the adrenaline starting to drain and leave her hollow. By the time she reached the cabin, Kyle had dragged the wounded man into the shade and was going through the bodies with clinical efficiency, checking for identification, weapons, anything useful. 2 of the dead men were strangers. The third was one of the bounty hunters who'd come looking for her days earlier. The wounded man was maybe 25, bleeding from a bullet hole in his thigh, his face pale with shock and pain. He watched Clara approach with wide, terrified eyes. "You're her," he gasped. "The lottery girl." "I'm not anybody's lottery anything," Clara said coldly. She was surprised by how steady her voice was. "Who sent you?" The man shook his head. Whether from pain or refusal, Clara couldn't tell. Kyle crouched beside him and pressed a thumb against the bullet wound. The man screamed. "Answer the question," Kyle said quietly. "Boone!" The word came out strangled. "Elias Boone hired us. $500 to bring her back alive, $250 if we had to kill you to do it." Clara felt ice slide down her spine. $500 was more money than most men saw in a year. Boone wasn't playing around anymore. "How many more are coming?" Kale asked, his thumb still pressing the wound. "I don't know. He's got riders all over the territory looking for her." The man was crying now, tears cutting tracks through the dust on his face. "Please, I need a doctor." "Nearest doctor is 2 days' ride," Kyle said flatly. "You'll bleed out before you get halfway, but I'll make you a deal. You give me something useful, I'll patch you up enough that you might survive." The man hesitated, loyalty and survival warring in his eyes. Survival won. Boone's planning something big. He's tired of sending small groups. He's gathering men, a lot of men, for one major push. I heard him talking about legal papers, contracts, some kind of marshal's warrant. The words tumbled out fast. He wants to make it official. Drag her back under the law so nobody can say he's wrong. Cale and Clara exchanged a look. A warrant changed everything. It meant Boone was escalating beyond hired thugs into territory that could bring down actual law enforcement. "When?" Clara demanded. "I don't know, I swear. Soon, maybe a week." The man's voice cracked. "That's all I know. Now help me, please." Cale studied him for a long moment, then stood and walked to his saddlebag. He returned with bandages and whiskey, tossing both to the wounded man. "Clean it, wrap it, and start riding. You tell Boone exactly what happened here. You tell him Clara Whitmore isn't some scared girl waiting to be collected. She's armed, she's dangerous, and she just put a bullet in your friend." Cale's voice was ice. "And if he keeps sending men into this canyon, they're all going home the same way, dead or broken. Understand?" The man nodded frantically, already pouring whiskey over his wound with shaking hands. Cale turned to Clara. "Help me with the bodies." They spent the next hour dragging corpses to a ravine a quarter mile from the cabin. It was grim work, made worse by the heat that was already making the bodies swell and stink. Claire's hands were covered in blood by the time they finished, and she'd thrown up twice in the rocks where Kyle couldn't see. When they finally made it back to the cabin, both of them collapsed in the shade, passing a canteen back and forth in silence. The wounded rider had managed to get himself on a horse and was disappearing into the canyon, listing badly in the saddle. "You saved my life," Cale said finally. "That rider circling around, I didn't see him. If you hadn't shot his horse, this would have ended different." "I missed him entirely," Clara said bitterly. "Had to shoot the animal instead. Dead is dead. The method doesn't matter." Cale took another drink, then handed her the canteen. "You did good, Clara. Kept your head, stayed mobile, gave me the opening I needed. May taught you well." Clara looked at her hands, still shaking slightly. "I killed a man today. Maybe 2 if that rider doesn't make it. Does that bother you?" She wanted to say yes, wanted to feel horror and guilt, and all the things a good person was supposed to feel. Instead, what she felt was tired, wired, and grimly satisfied that she was still breathing. "It should bother me more than it does," she said quietly. Kyle was silent for a moment. You want my advice? Don't feel guilty for surviving. Those men came here to kill or capture you. You stopped them. That's not murder. That's consequence. Easy to say. No, it's not. It's the hardest truth you'll ever swallow. Kyle stood and offered her his hand. Come on, we need to pack supplies and get moving. Clara took his hand and let him pull her up. Moving where? May's place. We need to tell her what that writer said about Boone's plans. Cale was already moving toward the cabin, his exhaustion buried under purpose. And then we need to decide if we're going to wait for Boone to come to us or if we're going hunting. Clara followed him inside, her mind spinning. Every instinct she'd been raised with screamed that hunting a powerful man was suicide. But those instincts belonged to the girl on the platform, the one who'd believed being good meant being safe. That girl was gone. They reached May's homestead 3 hours later, riding hard and checking their back trail constantly. May met them with her rifle and a grim expression that said she'd already guessed something had happened. How many? She asked. 5 came. 2 dead, 1 wounded, 2 ran, Kyle said, dismounting. Boone's escalating. He's planning a major push with legal backing. May's face went hard. Get inside. We need to talk strategy. They gathered in May's cabin, the 3 of them standing around her rough table while May pulled out a hand-drawn map of the territory. She marked locations with rocks and spent bullets. Dead Horse Crossing, Boone's mining operations, the Canyon homesteads, known trails. If Boone's going legal, he'll need a territorial marshal, May said, tracing a line between points. Nearest marshal's office is in Red Creek, about 80 miles northeast. If he's got papers filed there, he could ride in here with a dozen deputies and claim he's just enforcing the law. Can he actually do that? Clara asked. Get a warrant for me? Depends on how much he's willing to lie and who he's willing to pay. May looked up, her eyes sharp. Dead Horse Crossing will back whatever story Boone tells. They'll say you were legally married in the lottery, that you're a runaway wife, maybe even claim Kyle kidnapped you. With enough money and the right judge, Boone can make almost anything look legal. So what do we do? Claire's hands were clenched into fists. Just wait for them to show up with badges and haul me away in chains? No, Kyle said quietly. We go to the source. Both women looked at him. He was staring at the map, his expression calculating. Boone's the problem, Kyle continued. Cut off the head, the body dies. He's funding the bounties, filing the legal papers, organizing the hunt. Without him, this whole thing falls apart. You're talking about killing one of the richest men in the territory, May said flatly. That's not a gunfight. That's suicide. I'm not talking about walking up and shooting him in broad daylight. Cale's finger moved to a spot on the map labeled Copper Ridge. Boone's got a private office at his main mining operation. He goes there every week to handle business, usually alone except for 1 or 2 guards. We hit him there, away from town, away from witnesses. And do what exactly? Clara demanded. Murder him? No. Force him to rescind the contracts, the warrants, all of it. Make him publicly declare that you're not his property, and never were. Cale looked at her directly. We give him a choice. His pride or his life. Most men choose life. And if he doesn't? Cale's silence was answer enough. May studied the map, her fingers drumming against the table. It's risky. Even if we get to him, making it stick is another problem. A man like Boone has lawyers, connections, people who'll come after us even if we succeed. So we make sure everyone knows why we did it, Clara said suddenly. Both of them turned to look at her. She leaned over the map, her mind racing. We don't just force Boone to back down. We expose what Dead Horse Crossing is doing. The bride lottery, the fake contracts, all of it. Make enough noise that even the territorial government can't ignore it. That's a nice idea, May said. But who's going to listen? The law's already corrupt. The newspapers don't care about what happens in backwater towns. Then we make them care. Claire's voice was getting stronger, clearer. We find the proof. The lottery records, the financial books, whatever documentation Hutchins and Boone have been using to make this look legal. We take it to someone who actually gives a damn, a territorial judge, a federal marshal, someone. Cale was watching her with something like approval in his eyes. That's a longer game, more moving parts. But it's permanent, Clara countered. Killing Boone just creates a power vacuum. Someone else slides into his place and the system keeps running. We need to burn the whole thing down. May smiled, sharp and predatory. Now you're thinking like someone who wants to win, not just survive. They spent the rest of the afternoon planning. May knew the layout of Boone's mining operation from her years in the territory. Cale had contacts, former outlaws, drifters, people who owed him favors, who could gather intelligence. Clara suggested they bring in more women, others who'd survived the lottery or escaped similar situations, to build a coalition of witnesses. If this works, May said as evening shadows filled her cabin, you'll make powerful enemies. Boone's just one piece. There are men across the whole territory running similar schemes. You expose Dead Horse Crossing, you threaten their profits. Good, Clara said. I want them threatened. I want them terrified. May and Cale exchanged a look, and May actually laughed. You've changed, girl. First time I met you, you could barely kill a chicken. Now you're planning to take down territorial corruption networks. I had good teachers, Clara said quietly. They left May's place at first light, riding back toward Cayel's Canyon with a plan that felt both brilliant and insane. They'd spend 2 weeks gathering information, recruiting allies, and preparing for a confrontation that could either free dozens of women or get them all killed. Clara rode beside Cayel, her rifle across her lap, watching the canyon walls bleed gold in the rising sun. A month ago, she'd been on a platform being sold like cattle. Now she was planning an assault on one of the most powerful men in the territory. You scared? Cayel asked, breaking the silence. Terrified, Clara admitted, but I'm more scared of going back to who I was. You can't go back. That's not how this works. Cayel guided his horse around a boulder. You cross certain lines, you don't get to uncross them. You killed men, Clara, helped bury bodies, planned an attack. The preacher's daughter is dead. Question is, who are you now? Clara thought about that as they rode. Who was she? Not the obedient girl who'd poured tea and read scripture, not the terrified woman on the platform, not even the survivor learning to shoot and track. She was something new, something forged in canyon heat and violence and the desperate need to stay free. She didn't have a name for it yet. I'm still figuring that out, she said finally. Good. Anyone who thinks they have themselves completely figured out is probably lying. Cale shifted in his saddle. Just make sure whoever you become is someone you can live with. They made it back to the cabin by mid-morning. The bodies were gone. Scavengers or the canyon itself, Clara didn't know and didn't care. But the blood was still there, dark stains in the dirt that wouldn't wash away. Cayel set about reinforcing their defenses while Clara organized their supplies. They worked in comfortable silence, the kind that came from two people who'd fought side by side and survived. Every so often, Clara caught herself watching him, the way he moved with purposeful efficiency, the way his hands were never far from a weapon, the way he seemed to carry the weight of past violence without letting it crush him. You ever regret it? She asked during a water break. Entering that lottery? Pulling me into your life? Cale took a long drink before answering. I regret that it was necessary. I don't regret doing it. Clara smiled, recognizing May's exact words. You two are more alike than you think. We've both survived things we shouldn't have. It leaves marks. Cale set down the canteen. But no, Clara. I don't regret you. You're turning into someone worth keeping alive. It was maybe the kindest thing he'd ever said to her, buried under typical Cale bluntness. Clara felt something warm bloom in her chest. Not romance exactly, but recognition, respect, the kind of bond that came from standing back to back against the world. Same to you, she said. Over the next 2 weeks, they turned the canyon into a fortress and a base of operations. Cale rode out 3 times to meet contacts, gathering intelligence on Boone's movements and routines. May sent word through her own network, reaching out to women who'd escaped similar situations and might be willing to testify. Clara spent her days training, shooting until her shoulders ached, tracking phantom enemies through the rocks, learning to move through the wilderness like something born to it. Her hands developed calluses thick enough that rope burns didn't hurt anymore. Her skin darkened from sun exposure. Her body turned lean and hard from constant physical work. The mirror in Cayel's cabin showed a stranger now. Gone was the soft-faced preacher's daughter with careful posture and nervous hands. In her place stood someone weathered and dangerous, with eyes that had seen death and a mouth that had forgotten how to smile in that practiced, demure way. Clara stared at her reflection one evening and barely recognized herself. She should have felt loss. Instead, she felt power. On the 13th day, Kyle returned from a scouting trip with news. Boone's at Copper Ridge. He'll be there for 3 days handling payroll and contract negotiations. Security's light, 2 guards, both ex-miners, not professionals. When do we move? Clara asked. Tomorrow night. May's meeting us at the northern ridge at sunset. Cale was already checking his weapons, movements sharp and focused. This is the chance we've been waiting for. We get Boone alone, force him to sign a statement rescinding all claims on you, and get out before anyone realizes what happened. And the proof? The documents from Dead Horse Crossing? May's got a contact who works in Hutchins' office. She's willing to steal the lottery records if we can guarantee protection afterward. Cale looked up. This all happens tomorrow. One shot. We miss. Boone disappears into security, and we'll never get this close again. Clara felt adrenaline start to spike through her system. Tomorrow. Everything they'd planned, everything they'd risked, it all came down to tomorrow. I'm ready, she said. Cale studied her for a long moment. Yeah, I believe you are. They spent that night in preparation. Clara cleaned her weapons 3 times, checked her ammunition, laid out her gear with obsessive precision. She couldn't sleep, couldn't stop her mind from running through scenarios. What could go wrong, how they'd escape, what she'd do if Boone refused. Around midnight, Kyle found her sitting outside staring at the stars. You should rest, he said, sitting beside her. Can't. Too wired. They sat in silence for a while, the canyon quiet except for wind moving through stone. My sister's name was Emily, Kyle said suddenly. She was 16 when they sold her. Looked a lot like you, actually. Dark hair, stubborn jaw, eyes that didn't quit even when they should have. Clara turned to look at him. He was staring at the horizon, his face carved in shadow. She used to say she was going to change the world, believed people were fundamentally good and the system just needed fixing. Cale's voice was rough. Took 3 months in that bastard's house to kill that belief. When I found her in the barn, she'd left a note. Just 3 words. I can't anymore. Claire's throat tightened. Kyle, I'm telling you this because tomorrow is dangerous. You might die. I might die. And if that happens, I want you to know why I've done everything I've done. He finally looked at her. Emily didn't get to fight back, but you do. And every time you pull that trigger, every time you refuse to quit, you're proving that women like her, like you, don't have to be victims. You can be survivors, warriors, whatever the hell you choose. I won't let you down, Clara said. You couldn't. You've already proven everything I hoped you would. Cale stood and offered his hand. Come on, get a few hours sleep. Tomorrow, we finish this. Clara took his hand and let him pull her to her feet. Tomorrow, they'd confront Elias Boone. Tomorrow, they'd either free themselves or die trying. But tonight, standing in the canyon with a man who'd become something like family, Clara felt ready for whatever came next. She'd been sold, hunted, shot at, and nearly broken. But she was still standing, still fighting, still free. And tomorrow, she'd make damn sure everyone knew it. They rode out at sunset, 3 shadows moving through red rock that glowed like embers in the dying light. Clara rode between Kyle and May, her rifle secure across her back, her revolver loaded and ready at her hip. Every muscle in her body was coiled tight, waiting for violence or salvation. She didn't know which would come first. The plan was simple, which Kyle had said was the only kind worth trusting. They'd approach Copper Ridge from the north where the mining operation backed against steep cliffs. May would stay with the horses while Kyle and Clara infiltrated the office building. 2 guards meant 2 problems. They'd handle both quietly if possible, loudly if necessary. Get to Boone, force his signature on the documents May's contact had prepared, and disappear before anyone realized what had happened. Simple. Except simple plans had a way of turning complicated the moment real life touched them. They reached the northern approach around midnight, leaving their horses in a shallow ravine with May standing watch. She pressed a folded paper into Clara's hand. This is the statement, May said quietly. Boone signs this. It's a legal declaration that he has no claim on you and never did. It also admits the lottery was fraudulent. Get his signature and get out. Don't wait around for conversation. Clara tucked the document inside her shirt. What if he refuses? Then you convince him. May's eyes were hard in the moonlight. Whatever it takes. Cale checked his weapons one final time, then looked at Clara. You ready? Clara thought about the platform in Dead Horse Crossing, the rope burns on her wrists, Pete Hendricks bleeding out in the canyon, the feeling of a gun kicking in her hands as she fought for her life. She thought about Emily, dead at 16 because nobody fought for her. "I'm ready," she said. They moved through the darkness like ghosts, using the terrain for cover, their boots silent on stone. Copper Ridge mining operation sprawled below them, half a dozen buildings surrounding the main shaft, equipment yards, worker barracks dark and quiet. The office building sat separate from the others, 2 stories of rough timber with lamplight glowing in the upper windows. Boone was there. Clara could feel it like electricity in her spine. They approached from behind, where shadows pooled thick against the building. One guard stood at the front entrance, smoking a cigarette and looking bored. The second was supposedly patrolling, but Kyle had spotted him asleep against the equipment shed 20 yards away. "Sloppy," Cale whispered. "Boone doesn't think he needs real security out here." "Good for us," Clara breathed back. They slipped around to the rear door. Kyle tested the handle, unlocked. Of course it was. Nobody expected an attack this far from civilization. They stepped inside into a narrow hallway that smelled like coal dust and tobacco. Stairs at the end led up to the second floor where light seeped under a closed door. Cale moved first, each step deliberate and silent. Clara followed, her heart hammering so loud she was sure it would give them away. The wooden stairs creaked once, and they both froze, hands on weapons, waiting for an alarm that never came. At the top of the stairs, Kyle paused outside the closed door. Voices filtered through, 2 men talking, one of them definitely Boone. His voice was deep, arrogant, the sound of someone who'd never been told no in his life. "Don't care how long it takes. I want that girl found and brought back. She's mine legally, and I'll be damned if some canyon hermit thinks he can interfere with—" Cale kicked the door open. The room exploded into chaos. Boone jumped up from behind a massive desk, papers scattering. The man with him, a thin, nervous type wearing spectacles, yelped and dove behind a filing cabinet. Cale had his rifle trained on Boone before anyone could reach for a weapon. "Sit down," Cale said flatly. Boone's face went from shock to rage in seconds. He was a big man, maybe 50, with the kind of body that had been strong once but was turning to fat. His suit probably cost more than most people made in a year. Everything about him screamed money and power and the absolute certainty that he was untouchable. "You," he snarled, recognizing Cale. "You're the bastard from the lottery, Varric. And you're the bastard who's been hunting my friend." Cale gestured with the rifle. "I said sit down." Boone sat slowly, his eyes moving to Clara as she stepped into the room. Recognition flashed across his face, followed by something uglier. Possession. Like he was looking at property that had wandered off. "Miss Whitmore," he said, his voice dripping false civility. "I'm glad you've finally come to your senses. If you turn yourself in now, I'll overlook this unfortunate incident with—" "Shut up," Clara said. Boone's mouth snapped closed, shock replacing arrogance. Clara walked forward until she was standing in front of his desk, her hand resting on her revolver. "I'm not here to turn myself in," she continued, her voice steady and cold. "I'm here to make you understand something. I am not your wife. I am not your property. I never was, and I never will be." "The lottery was legal," Boone blustered. "I have documents, contracts signed by—" "You have lies written on expensive paper." Clara pulled the folded statement from her shirt and slapped it on the desk. "And now you're going to sign this, declaring that every single one of those contracts was fraudulent, that the lottery was illegal, that you have no claim on me or any other woman sold in Dead Horse Crossing." Boone didn't even look at the paper. "Like hell I will. Then we'll do this the hard way." Kyle stepped closer, the rifle now inches from Boone's head. "Sign the paper, or I put a bullet through your skull and burn this whole operation to the ground. Your choice. You won't shoot me. You kill me. Every lawman in the territory will hunt you down." Boone's voice was shaking now, but he was trying to maintain control. "I'm a respected businessman. You're nothing but outlaws." "Respected?" Clara repeated, letting the word hang in the air like poison. "You call yourself respected while you buy women like cattle? While you fund a system that destroys lives for profit?" "It's business," Boone snapped. "The territory needs wives, and those women needed husbands. I facilitated a transaction that benefited everyone." Clara's hand moved before she realized what she was doing. The slap cracked across Boone's face hard enough to snap his head sideways. Her palm stung. She didn't care. Those women needed freedom, Clara said, her voice shaking with rage. They needed safety. Instead, you and men like you turned them into merchandise. You destroyed families, ruined lives, and called it business. Boone touched his reddening cheek, something dangerous flickering in his eyes. You little— Sign the paper, Kael interrupted, his voice deadly quiet. Last chance. No. Boone leaned back in his chair, some of his arrogance returning. You're not going to kill me. You might be an outlaw, Varric, but you're not a murderer. And the girl certainly doesn't have the stomach for it. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to walk out of here empty-handed, and I'm going to continue hunting until Clara is back where she belongs, in chains. Clara looked at this man who'd spent a fortune trying to own her, who'd sent armed men to drag her back, who sat there surrounded by evidence of his crimes and still believed he was untouchable because money and power had always protected him before. She thought about May's words. You either spit out the poison, or it kills you from the inside. Clara drew her revolver and pressed the barrel against Boone's forehead. Sign, she said. The room went silent. Boone's eyes widened, his breath coming faster. Kael didn't move, didn't interfere, just watched to see what Clara would do. You won't, Boone whispered, but his voice was uncertain now. You don't know what I will or won't do, Clara said quietly. A month ago, you'd have been right. The preacher's daughter wouldn't have hurt anyone. But she's dead. You helped kill her when you entered that lottery, thinking you could buy a human being. So let me be very clear. I will pull this trigger. I will end you right here, and I will sleep just fine afterward because the world will be better without you in it. Her finger tightened on the trigger. Not enough to fire, but enough that Boone could feel the pressure shift. But I'm going to give you one chance, Clara continued. One choice. Sign the paper and publicly admit what you've done, or die right now and let someone else clean up the mess. What's it going to be? Sweat was pouring down Boone's face now. His hands were shaking. For the first time in probably his entire life, Elias Boone understood that money couldn't save him. The pen, Clara said to the nervous man still hiding behind the filing cabinet. Bring it here. The man scrambled forward with a pen, his hand shaking as bad as Boone's. Clara took it and set it on the desk, never moving the gun from Boone's forehead. Sign! Boone's hand trembled as he picked up the pen. He looked at the document, really looked at it for the first time. Clara watched him read the words that would destroy his reputation and expose the lottery system that had made him rich. If I sign this, he said hoarsely, I'll be ruined, arrested. Everything I've built, everything you've built was constructed on the backs of broken women, Clara interrupted. You deserve worse than ruin. You deserve what you put them through, but I'm not a monster like you. I'm giving you a choice. Sign and live with the consequences or refuse and die right here. The pen touched paper. Boone's signature sprawled across the bottom of the document, shaky but legible. Legal. Binding. Clara lowered the gun but didn't holster it. She picked up the signed statement and held it up to the lamplight, verifying every word was visible. If you come after me again, she said quietly, if you send anyone after me, if you so much as speak my name, I will find you, and next time I won't give you a choice. She turned to leave. Kael backed toward the door, rifle still trained on Boone. That's when the nervous man behind the filing cabinet pulled a derringer from his coat. Look out! Kael shouted. The derringer cracked. Clara felt something punch her in the left shoulder, spinning her sideways. She hit the wall hard, the signed document falling from her hand. Pain exploded through her entire body, white-hot and overwhelming. Kael's rifle spoke twice. The nervous man collapsed, the derringer clattering from his lifeless hand. Boone was screaming something, diving for the desk drawer where he probably kept another weapon. Clara pushed off the wall, her left arm hanging useless, blood already soaking through her shirt. She raised her revolver with her right hand and fired. The bullet caught Boone in the shoulder and slammed him back into his chair. Don't, Clara gasped. Don't make me kill you. Boone sat there, clutching his bleeding shoulder, his face twisted in pain and disbelief. You shot me, he wheezed. You actually shot me. You tried to have me killed. Clara's voice was fading, shock starting to set in. What did you expect? Kael grabbed the signed document from the floor and Clara's good arm. We need to move, now. They stumbled down the stairs, Clara's vision swimming. Behind them, Boone was shouting for help, his voice echoing through the building. The guard from the front entrance burst through the door just as they reached the bottom of the stairs. Kyle didn't hesitate. He fired once, and the guard went down clutching his leg. They ran past him into the night, Clara's boots barely cooperating, her whole left side screaming. May was waiting with the horses, her eyes going wide when she saw the blood. What happened? Ambush. Clara's hit. Cale practically threw Clara onto her horse. Ride hard. They'll be coming. The next few hours were a blur of pain and motion. Clara clung to her horse's mane with her good hand while May rode beside her, keeping her upright when she started to slide. The bullet wound throbbed with every hoofbeat, and she could feel blood running down her side, soaking into her clothes. Behind them, shouts and gunfire erupted as Boone's men mobilized, but the canyon was dark, and they knew the terrain. By the time their pursuers organized enough to give chase, Clara and her companions had disappeared into the wilderness like smoke. They rode until dawn, putting miles between themselves and Copper Ridge. Finally, when Clara was barely conscious and swaying dangerously in the saddle, Cale called a halt in a hidden ravine. "Help me get her down," he said to May. They lowered Clara to the ground as gently as possible, but she still cried out when they moved her shoulder. May cut away the shirt while Kyle built a small fire. The bullet had gone clean through. Good news meant no digging for fragments. Bad news, the exit wound was ragged and bleeding heavily. "This is going to hurt," May warned. She poured whiskey over both wounds and Clara screamed, the sound echoing off canyon walls. Then May packed the holes with clean cloth and wrapped them tight enough that Clara's vision went white. When she could breathe again, she found Kyle holding the signed document, the paper now stained with her blood. "Was it worth it?" she asked through gritted teeth. "We'll find out," he said. "But you did good, Clara. You faced him down and won." "Doesn't feel like winning." "Winning never does. It just feels like surviving with purpose." Cale folded the document carefully. "Rest now. We'll move again at nightfall." Clara closed her eyes and let darkness take her. She woke 3 days later in May's cabin, her shoulder wrapped in fresh bandages and her body feeling like it had been trampled by horses. May was sitting beside the cot, cleaning a rifle. "Welcome back," May said. "You've been in and out for days. Fever finally broke this morning." Clara tried to sit up and immediately regretted it. "Where's Kyle?" "Riding to Red Creek. He's taking Boone's signed confession to the territorial marshal, along with the lottery records my contact stole from Dead Horse Crossing." May set the rifle aside. "If it works, this whole system comes down. Every town running bride lotteries, every corrupt official taking bribes, all of it exposed. And if it doesn't work, then we disappear into the canyon and spend the rest of our lives running." May's voice was matter of fact. "But I don't think it'll come to that. Boone's signature carries weight, and those lottery records show a pattern of fraud that even corrupt officials can't ignore. You started something, Clara, something bigger than just saving yourself." Clara lay back staring at the rough ceiling. Her shoulder throbbed, her whole body ached, and she'd never felt more exhausted in her life. But beneath the pain, something else was growing. Pride, maybe. Or just the satisfaction of knowing she'd fought back and survived. Kyle returned 5 days later, dusty and tired, but with news that made Clara sit up despite the pain. "The marshal arrested Boone," he said, dropping into May's other chair. "Took one look at that signed confession and the lottery records and started issuing warrants. Hutchins is in custody. 3 other mayors in neighboring towns are being investigated. The whole thing's unraveling." "What about the women?" Clara asked. "The ones already sold?" "Marshal's declaring the marriages void. Women can leave if they want, and there's a fund being set up to help them relocate." Kyle allowed himself a small smile. "Your story's spreading, Clara. The woman who refused to be owned, who fought a man like Boone and won. People are talking." Clara didn't know how to feel about that. She wasn't a hero. She was just someone who'd been pushed too far and pushed back. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. "That's up to you," Kyle said. "The canyon's always open if you want to stay. May's willing to teach you more. Or you could go somewhere else, start fresh where nobody knows your history." Claire looked between these 2 people who'd saved her life and taught her how to save herself. May, hard and unbreakable, who'd survived her own nightmare and built a life from the ashes. Kyle, carrying the weight of his sister's death but still fighting to protect others from the same fate, and herself. Clara Whitmore, no longer the preacher's daughter, no longer a lottery prize, just a woman who'd learned that freedom was something you fought for, not something given. "I'll stay," she said. "The canyon suits me." May nodded approval. "Then we've got work to do. Word's spreading. Other women are going to come looking for what we've built here. A place where they can learn to defend themselves, where nobody owns them." "A sanctuary," Clara said softly. "More than that," Kyle said. "A training ground. You, me, May. We're living proof that you don't have to accept what the world tries to force on you. We can teach others. Build something permanent." Over the following weeks, they did exactly that. Clara's shoulder healed slowly, leaving a scar she wore without shame. More women arrived, some from Dead Horse Crossing, others from towns across the territory where similar systems had operated. Each one carried trauma. Each one was ready to learn. Clara taught them to shoot, to track, to move through wilderness without fear. May taught them hand-to-hand combat, survival skills, the practical knowledge that kept you alive when everything else failed. Kyle taught them strategy, planning, how to think 3 steps ahead of anyone trying to hurt them. They built cabins, planted gardens, created a community where strength was valued more than obedience, where scars were proof of survival rather than shame. 6 months after that night in Boone's office, Clara stood on the ridge overlooking what they'd built. A dozen cabins now dotted the canyon, smoke rising from chimneys. Women worked in gardens, practiced with weapons, trained together. Some would stay permanently. Others would leave once they felt strong enough to face the world again. May appeared beside her, carrying 2 cups of coffee. She handed one to Clara. "We did something good here," May said quietly. "We did something necessary," Clara corrected. "Good makes it sound optional." May smiled. "You sound like me now. That's either terrifying or perfect." "Maybe both." They stood in silence, watching the community below. Clara thought about the platform in Dead Horse Crossing, about the woman she'd been then, terrified, helpless, waiting for someone to save her. That woman was gone, burned away by canyon heat and violence, and the simple realization that salvation wasn't coming from outside. You had to save yourself, and then you had to help others do the same. Cale joined them on the ridge, his presence solid and steady. "Beth showed up this morning," he said. "The one from the lottery, Silas Root's bride. She escaped and walked 4 days to get here." Claire remembered Beth, the woman clutching a rag doll dragged away by a 70-year-old man. "Is she okay?" "She will be, once we teach her what we taught you." Cale looked at Clara. "She asked for you specifically, said she heard about the woman who shot Elias Boone and wanted to learn how to do the same." Clara felt something shift in her chest. Not pride exactly. Responsibility, maybe. These women were coming here because she'd proven it was possible to fight back. That meant something. That meant she couldn't quit, couldn't fail, couldn't let the weight of what they'd built crush her. "I'll talk to her," Clara said. As the sun set, painting the canyon in familiar shades of blood and copper, Clara walked down to meet Beth. The young woman looked broken, hollow-eyed, barely holding together. Clara recognized that look. She'd worn it herself once. "You're Clara Whitmore," Beth whispered. "I am. They say you stood up to Boone, put a gun to his head and made him sign a confession." "I did." "Were you scared?" Clara thought about that. "Terrified. But I was more scared of staying broken, so I chose to be dangerous instead." Beth's eyes filled with tears. "Can you teach me? I don't want to be afraid anymore." Clara put a hand on Beth's shoulder, the one that still ached when storms rolled through, the one that bore a scar from a bullet meant to silence her. That scar was a reminder, not of trauma, but of the moment she chose to fight back. "I can teach you," Claire said. "But understand, what you learn here will change you. You won't be the same person when you leave. You'll be harder, sharper, less willing to accept the world as it is." "Good," Beth said fiercely. "I don't want to be who I was. That person got sold like cattle." Clara smiled, recognizing her own words from months ago. "Then let's get started." They walked together toward the training ground where other women were practicing with rifles, their shots echoing off canyon walls like thunder. Clara picked up a revolver and handed it to Beth, watching the young woman's hands shake as she held the weapon. It gets easier, Clara said. Not the fear. That never really leaves. But you learn to move through it instead of letting it paralyze you. Beth nodded, gripping the gun tighter. Show me. So Clara did. She showed Beth everything she'd learned, how to stand, how to aim, how to pull the trigger without flinching, how to see violence not as something that happened to you, but as a tool you could wield. As the stars came out and the canyon filled with the sounds of women learning to fight, Clara felt something settle in her chest. Not peace. She doubted she'd ever feel truly peaceful again, but purpose. Certainty that what they were building here mattered. May joined her as the training session wound down, the two of them watching Beth practice her stance. You ever think about what comes next? May asked. After all this? This is what comes next, Clara said. Building something permanent, making sure other women have the chance we fought for. And if more men like Boone come looking, Clara's hand moved to her revolver, the motion automatic now. Then we handle them the same way we handled him. We don't run. We don't hide. We draw a line and dare them to cross it. May nodded approval. The canyon's lucky to have you. The canyon made me, Clara said quietly, stripped away everything soft and showed me what I could be when I stopped apologizing for surviving. They stood together as night claimed the sky. Two women who'd refused to stay broken. Behind them, the canyon settlement glowed with lamplight and the sounds of people building lives on their own terms. Clara thought about her father's old lessons, about goodness and obedience and the belief that being quiet kept you safe. All lies. Comfortable lies that the world told women to keep them compliant. The truth was simpler and harder. Safety came from strength. Freedom came from fighting. And sometimes the only way to survive was to become dangerous enough that people thought twice before trying to hurt you. She'd learned that lesson the hard way, written in scars and gunpowder and the hollow echo of men who'd tried to own her and failed. Now she was teaching others, building an army of women who refused to be sold, broken, or silenced. It wouldn't fix everything. The world was still full of men like Boone, systems designed to exploit the vulnerable, corruption that ran deeper than one confession could expose. But it was a start. Clara Whitmore, former preacher's daughter, lottery survivor, canyon guardian, stood on the ridge and looked at what they'd built. A sanctuary, a training ground, a promise that women didn't have to accept the roles forced on them. The canyon stretched endlessly in all directions, beautiful and merciless, a place that demanded strength and gave nothing for free. Clara belonged here now, not because she'd been brought in chains or sold on a platform, but because she'd chosen it, had fought for the right to stand on this ground and call it hers. And that made all the difference. As she turned